All right, well, thank you all for joining us. Today we're going to dig into land records. This is one of probably the most overlooked resources for both genealogists and historians. Those land records don't get as much attention as I think they really ought to get. I'm going to start with technical details. So if some of this is familiar, please bear with me. I want to make sure that everyone is on the same page and knows exactly how to get the most out of land records. So we're going to start with the technical information, how to actually access this stuff, and then move on to some hidden treasures. What can be found in land records that you might not expect? So accessing land records in person, always a fun option if you can do it. The accessibility varies from state to state and town to town. It's really important to check the rules before you go look at land records in person, because it might be different depending on the town. And it also is going to be different depending on where we're at in the pandemic. I know a lot of places are appointment only, such as Bridgeport still says appointment only on their website. Derby, City Hall is restricted. They won't let you in. So it's different everywhere you go. So you always want to check in advance before you just show up. Land records are mostly used by realtors, by attorneys involved with real estate transactions, not surprisingly. The fee for all of these different types of activities that they do is, in Connecticut, it is set by state law. Most of this, as a genealogist, you don't have to worry about. Because you're not going to be doing most of these sorts of things. The one thing that does pertain to genealogists, to historians, is this one right here. $20 per day use of handheld battery-powered scanner. That language is the language that's codified in state law. That's the language that they chose to use. A handheld battery-powered scanner includes your cell phone. It includes a camera. So that's what I have found to be the most useful thing for me, is just whipping out my cell phone. I've got a good camera on it and taking photos that way. And so this was a huge bit of progress, I guess is maybe how I want to say it, in doing research with land records. It used to be very restricted. You weren't actually allowed to take photographs for a long time, and you had to go through all of these, per page for the copies and this and that and the other thing. But they finally recognized that, modern technology is here. And so you do have to sort of sign in with the town clerk in order to get that access. But it is a huge asset to be able to take those photographs. The location of the land records is going to depend on where you are all around the country. So in Connecticut, the land records are held by the town clerk for each municipality. But for example, in Maryland, where I did a lot of genealogical research a couple of years ago, everything is in the state archives for the 1700s, which is what I was looking at. So depending on what state you're looking at, what time period you're looking at, you might not find them where you think you're going to find them. They could be in a lot of different places. So again, do your research in advance before you hit the road. So accessing land records from the comfort of your own home online. In Connecticut, there are generally two places for the online land records. The newer land records are going to be found in a searchable database that is maintained by the town clerk's office. These can go back a few decades. Sometimes they go back a few centuries, depending on how far along that town clerk's office has gotten in getting everything digitized. So the links, how to find each one, you can go to the town website. Sometimes you'll find it there. You can also go to websites like this one, which will have links to each town in Connecticut. So this is the website of the Connecticut Attorney's Title Insurance Company, or CATIC, as it says there. So when you go to this particular website, You can see it gives you the list of each town in alphabetical order with a link to where you're going to get those land records online. And most of the towns use really only 3 different third-party vendors really to host their site. So there's Record Hub, there's InfoQuick Solutions, and there's US Land Records. So again, each town is, doing their own thing, and you're going to find different information depending on what each town has done. So let's see. So for Waterbury, here's what the interface looks like for Waterbury. So you're going to plug in the basic information. Waterbury's online database for land records goes back to the late 1970s, I believe. That's the oldest that I've really found on there. So in this case, I've just plugged in the company name Scoville to see what will turn up. And what turns up, Scoville Manufacturing, late 1970s. You're not going to get too much more than this information. The Waterbury Town Clerk does not have copies of the actual deeds on this database. What it does give you is the book number and the page number, so that you can then go into the vaults for the town clerk and actually pull up the actual deed information. So it'll give you, in this case, they're calling it the party and the opposite party, the grantee, the grantor, the type of deed that it is, and then again, the book number. So book number 1254, page 198 is that first one from 1977. Now in Maryland, so it's a little different in Maryland. Maryland has put everything online, which is good that they have put so much information online, that they have scanned so many of their land records, that they have so much that's available there. The only thing I will say is that the Maryland website is really difficult to use. I basically have to have a cheat sheet to remember how to access anything on their website, because it's all this very cryptic system. You would expect volumes to be numbered, number 1, number 2, number 3. They didn't do it that way. They have a completely different system. So it's very confusing. Once you do figure out how to navigate it, it will take you to some really great stuff. So for Maryland, here are the land records from the 1790s. The volume number is volume WR12, page 20. So like I said, their numbering system is very confusing, but it's right there, and you can download the copy of that land record, which is a really great resource to have. It's really convenient because you can just sit there at home and access everything that you're trying to get to. So land records have been digitized. So the Church of Latter-day Saints went through and originally it was all put onto microfilm. So land records from all over the country were put onto microfilm. And all of those microfilm reels have since been scanned and put online in their database. And we're going to talk about that a little bit more in depth here. So the FamilySearch website, I've talked about it before. It is so useful. It is so helpful. It's free, and it has just so much great information on it. So to search for the land records for a particular town, you go to their catalog search, and you're going to type in the place, and you're going to select that it's going to be online. That's going to take you to all of their records for Waterbury. Depending on the records you're looking for, you might not want to search by the town. You might want to search by the county, and you might even want to try searching by the state, depending on how things are set up. So you always want to check in a couple of different places. When you click on land and property, it gives you these 3 options. The first one being the actual land records, the next one being the proprietor's records, which is the book that was published in the 1800s, or actually early 1900s, and then town records as well. So when we click on the option for the land records, this is going to take us to the whole long list of all of the microfilm reels that they have. So the first couple reels are the general index to what they have, and then after that are the actual individual volumes that are all online. The catch, of course, is what you see here under format. So what you see for the format here is a camera and a little key over the camera. In order to view the microfilm, you're going to click on that camera. If there's a key over the camera, however, that means that you have to go to one of their affiliate sites in order to access it. So for me, living in Waterbury, the closest site is the Southbury Public Library. So I can actually take my laptop computer to Southbury, I get onto their Wi-Fi system, log into their Wi-Fi, and these images become unlocked. So that little key lets you know you have to unlock it in order to access it. So it's not quite as convenient. A lot of the land records are like this on the FamilySearch website. A lot of them do require you to go to one of their official affiliate sites in order to access them. Some of them are available anywhere, but it's still free. It's just a matter of being in the right location. So then just a little primer on how to actually search land records. So the first option is a title search. And with a title search, you're looking at the volume number and the page number. So in this case, we're in volume 801 on page 594. And when you're looking at the 1900s, they did a good job of giving you the volume number and the page number of the deed immediately preceding this deed. So you can go backwards in time by tracing the volume and the page number, and you can work backwards through the deeds if you want to follow the ownership of a specific property. They did a really good job of this in the 1900s. They did a fairly good job of this in the late 1800s, but when you go further back in time, they didn't. They weren't concerned about title searches. So you will often hit a dead end if you're trying to search the history of ownership of a specific property. So that's where the index search comes in. And this, if you're doing genealogy, might actually be something that is what you're more likely to use. So the index search is exactly what it sounds like. Each volume of land records has an index. Sometimes you're going to see an index in the front of the book and an index in the back of the book. So one of the indices will be for the grantee and the other one will be for the grantor. So these are going to be arranged alphabetically. Sometimes they are strictly alphabetical. Sometimes they are, in this case, as you see here, this is all of the last names starting with an H are on the same page, but then it is in order of page numbers. So you still have to scan down through all of the names. You do want to check both of the sets of indices, the one in the front of the book, the one in the back of the book. Sometimes with these older records, they get jumbled up together, all in the front of the book, depending on how it was bound for archival storage. So you got to kind of look around, but you should always be able to find two sets of indices for a single volume. When you get more into the 1800s, you might find an entire book that is the index for several volumes of land records. And these, again, are going to be arranged one set of grantor to grantee and another set that's grantee to grantor. Last name, sometimes you might actually get straightforward, completely alphabetical, as in the case of these land records, which can simplify your search. The volume number and the page number to go to. So here's the flip, here's the grantee from grantor. So there's always going to be these two indexes that you're going to want to refer to. It gets confusing sometimes. So this is a whole learning curve in itself. So here for the New Haven land records, they have done a double column. So if I go back, here's Derby, very nice, very clean, very straightforward. Each page has a single list. It tells you the grantee, tells you the grantor, the volume number, the page number. You get to New Haven and it throws you off a little bit because they've smushed it all down trying to save paper. So it's all smushed down into 2 columns per page. I've seen examples where one page will have grantee to grantor and the other page will have grantor to grantee. It can be very confusing. So you always have to kind of have a little patience when you're looking at how they put together the index, because it can be a little bit confusing and take a little bit of time. The other thing that I have found is that if you have a book that is the index to multiple volumes, it might not include everything. I have found that a lot of times when they do a comprehensive index for multiple volumes, they will include quite literally only actual land deeds. So if there's something in that volume of land records that isn't actually a land record, they won't include it. So it's very beneficial to actually go volume by volume and look at the index for each individual volume, because it might have things that aren't in the comprehensive index. So now getting into a little bit more of the fun stuff here. So Waterbury's land records, one of my favorite places. This is the vault at City Hall, past the town clerk's office. The first floor has the more recent records. On the shelves on the left there, you can see the more recent records. In the back, underneath the mezzanine, are additional types of records, as well as maps of individual properties, which are really helpful. They also have corporate deeds on the first floor. And then when you go upstairs to the mezzanine, where I spend a lot of time, you have the older land record volumes. These are big, these are heavy. You need a little bit of strength. You get a good workout going back and forth, carrying these to the table and back again. Couple of, ground rules. Anytime you're dealing with archival material, of course, make sure your hands are clean, no food, no drink. We want to make sure these are well preserved going forward. The most basic information that you're going to get, that I think everyone would assume that you're going to get from a land record, is you're going to get the name of the person who owns the property. You're going to find out when they bought it, when they sold it. You might see their spouse's name. You might see some additional information. For early records, you might find out if the person was able to write their own name, if they were literate. A lot of times people sign their name with a mark because they were not literate. If you're looking for information from, I'd say from about before the 1870s, you really need to look at the land records. That's if there's any chance that the person you're looking for was a property owner, definitely look at the land records. City directories are a great resource, but they are limited. They don't really start until, depending on what city you're talking about, the 1840s, 1850s, 1860s. But they don't include really comprehensive information. So you're going to see a lot more in the land records than you might in other sources. So what types of things? What types of things are you going to find in the land records? So here are some hidden treasures. Here's an overview of some of the types of things that you're going to find in the land records, and why you definitely want to take a look at them. So some of the oldest records, you're actually going to see some of the Native Americans who were in this area. So here's a deed from 1711 from the Pagusset Sagamore and his son Tom, who owned a piece of land in Waterbury and sold it to the town of Waterbury in this deed. And you can see that they signed with their marks on the inset picture here, since they were not literate and did not have a written out name. With this individual, Kankapatani, and I don't know how to pronounce his name correctly, I have seen a lot of different spellings of his name because it's phonetic, because it wasn't English. And so the folks who are writing these documents are writing it the way it sounds to them. So he was a very important figure in this whole region in the late 1600s and early 1700s. And it's through the land deeds that we're able to find out a lot more information about him and about the Pagussets that were here. So for this one, we're starting to see a little bit about family groups and seeing how families interact with each other. So in this deed from 1703, Stephen Welton of Waterbury, in exchange for a horse, a young steer, and a parcel of timber, gave his brother Richard Welton his house and 3 acres of land, which he had previously purchased from Ephraim Warner. So this is a great, he's specifying, this is my brother. And I love the fact that he is selling him this house, not for money, but for livestock and timber, which, really is quite a story about what's happening in 1703 and about this small family group. This one I got started on. There's an Umberfield Road in Waterbury. One of the oldest houses in Waterbury is on that Umberfield Road. So I've been trying to figure out the history of that house and tried doing the title deed search going backwards and hit that dead end in the 1800s. So then I tried going the other direction. Well, let me just go to those earliest land records and just look for Umberfield. And what I found has just confused me more than anything, really. So what we have are land records. Samuel Umberfield is how his name is listed in the index, but as you can see in the actual land deed, his name is Samuel Umphreyville, UMPH. And then when you look at the family later, it's actually Humphreyville with an H at the beginning. So there's a couple different variations on that name. Samuel Umberfield or Umphreyville or Umpervilde, many different variations on that name, was actually a New Haven resident who was buying land in Waterbury. So this is another thing to think about if the person you're researching lived in one town but owned property in another town. That can be a little tricky to search for. This particular deed tells us also about the bishops. Samuel Bishop and Abigail Bishop witnessed this land record, Abigail presumably being the wife of Samuel Bishop. Samuel Bishop is able to sign his own name, but Abigail is not. She's not literate. She does, however, make a very stylized letter A as her mark when she signs her name. So here we have more on the Umberfields or Humphreyvilles. So this is, again, I found this looking for Umberfield and it directed me to a page with Humphreyville. So clearly interchangeable use of names here. And here it says, April 1751, laid out to David and Benjamin Humphreyville of New Haven, specifying the land, laid out on their father, Samuel Humphreyville's right. So right there, you have a little bit of the genealogy. So you know now that Samuel definitely had 2 sons, one named David, one named Benjamin. That right there can help tremendously when you're looking at this time period, trying to figure out who everyone was in the family. And then here, going further with the Humphreyville / Umberfield family, here's another document that pertains to his heirs and what they inherited. And so you have husbands and wives, as well as men who are there on their own. One of the things, so this is an inheritance situation. So, all of the children inherit the property and they have to agree to sell it or divide it up, however the case may be. One of the things you're going to find in this time period, when a wife inherits land, she doesn't have sole ownership. Her husband co-owns it with her automatically. So here we see the daughters are signing with their husbands because they don't have the legal right to be the sole owner because they have husbands. The reverse is not true. If a husband inherits property, he inherits it. His wife does not necessarily stake a claim on it. In this time period, when the husband dies, the wife is entitled to 1/3 of his estate. But again, she doesn't have the same legal rights to real estate that her husband would. Making it more complicated, a single woman has real estate rights that a married woman wouldn't have. And then there's some rare ones, like Joseph Scott's location of where he was killed. So here's one of those really rare things that you're going to find in the land records. The only reason why we know that this is here is that in the late 1800s, Sarah Pritchard, when she was doing all the research for that 3-volume set on Waterbury's history, she read everything. She read all of Waterbury's land records, and she made notes, and she tracked everything down. She did a fantastic job. So we know that there is this record that says, laid out for Richard Seymour, 2 acres of land where Joseph Scott was killed. So this is just those, really rare but important pieces of information. And I do have to give a shout out to Sarah Pritchard. She's one of my favorite people. The work she did on Waterbury history, those first 2 volumes of what gets referred to as Anderson's History of Waterbury, that was all her. That was almost entirely her work, her research that she did. If you try to do similar genealogical or historical research in other towns where they didn't have someone like Sarah Pritchard, it's a lot harder. So she's made all of our work here in Waterbury a lot easier. So what else? Sometimes in land records, you're going to find information about civil and criminal cases. So here is a case about David Worcester, who was convicted of committing treason during the Revolutionary War. And the state of Connecticut, as part of the penalty for his act of treason, was to pay a huge fine. He could not afford that fine. He didn't have that kind of money. And so the state took his land. They took the equivalent of the amount owed. So there is this documentation to the sheriff of the county of New Haven or his deputy or either the constables of the town of Waterbury, that basically saying David Worcester was found guilty. He was charged this money for actually technically misprision of treason. So it's not so much that he committed treason, it's that he knew treason was being committed and he didn't tell anyone. And so they basically sent the sheriff in to appraise his land and decide what chunk of his property was going to become property of the state, since he didn't have enough money to pay the fine that he owed. This also happened in civil cases. So this is the related civil case. So all of this has to do with the story of Chauncey Judd, which is a pretty well-known story in the Naugatuck Valley. Chauncey Judd was kidnapped. He was repeatedly threatened. He went through a really horrible experience where he was traumatized severely by the loyalists who had kidnapped him. And I did a bunch of research into this. One of the things I found that was interesting is that none of the people who kidnapped him was ever tried for kidnapping. That wasn't one of the things that they were taken to criminal court for. That wasn't really registered as a crime. That was a civil case. So the state went after them for treasonous activity, but Chauncey Judd sued them in civil court for what they did to him. And he won. He didn't win as much as he had asked for, but he still got a pretty sizable settlement against the men who were directly involved with his kidnapping and all of the trauma that he experienced. And so again, that's in the land records. That information about how much money he was awarded for damages and how that money was paid out to him is all in the land records. There's also a lot of documentation from Connecticut's era of slavery in the land records, which is not something that I think a lot of people realize. So this document from 1781 says, "Know all men by these presents that I, Roswell Ransom of Colchester in Connecticut, having bought of Lemuel Nichols of Waterbury in said state, a Negro boy named Parse," I think it's actually Pierce in a later document, about 20 years old, and having taken a bill of sale of said boy, bearing date, with these presents, promise and engage that when the said Negro has served me a sufficient time, which I judge shall be about 6 or 8 years from the date hereof, to satisfy me for his freedom, then the above named parse shall be free and act for himself without my, I'm actually not sure what control, without my control. So this is actually a pretty cool document. This is someone who is enslaved. He is sold by Lemuel Nichols of Waterbury to Roswell Ransom of Colchester, but Roswell Ransom promises to give him his freedom. Says, come work for me for 6 to 8 years, and then you will be guaranteed that you will be emancipated, you will be free. And this is in the Waterbury Land Records book. So this is something where this is a sale transaction that's happening in Waterbury, and they made sure that the Waterbury records are very clear that he's not being sold as a slave for life, that he is going to be emancipated. And then there's a second document that comes a couple of years later that again emphasizes, now his name is spelled Pierce, now thankfully a Negro man, not a boy, and that again, that he will be given his freedom, and then specifying exactly when this is going to happen. So it's not a vague thing. So again, this is something that technically is happening in a different town, but because this young man was originally from Waterbury, the Waterbury land records have that information written down to help ensure that he would get his freedom. One of the other things that's important about this is that sometimes this is the only place you're going to see records of specific people. So here is a document for Roger Isaac, who lived in Waterbury, and there's very little information about him. Very little. I have tried now that, after finding him in the land records, I looked for him elsewhere, and very hard to find. I found him in the, came up quickly in searches for the census records for Oxford, where he later lived. So he shows up in Oxford in the 1800 and the 1820 census records, and that's it. I can't find him, I haven't found him anywhere else. So the place with the most information about Roger Isaac is actually in the land records. So here we have 1780. They list in this time period, if you're not white, they are going to list, or even if you're more specifically not of English descent, they might list your ethnicity alongside your name. So Roger Isaac Negro, making sure you know that he's not white. They didn't always do this, but they did do it from time to time. So here he is purchasing property in Waterbury in 1780, and this is in Salem society, so downriver. Here's another document. In this case, his full name is left off the top of the document where it just says Roger Negro. It leaves out his last name. This is something that happens a lot when you're looking at African-American genealogy in the late 1700s, that their last name is not always given. This happens a lot in the census records, and it can be a challenge. So here, and actually just going back to Roger real quick, again, just want to emphasize that these land records are the most information that I've been able to find out about him. So, this is an example of really how important the land records are. If you were trying to do this genealogy, you'll find him in the census records in Oxford, but really not a lot of information elsewhere. So when you get into those land records, that's really when you start to find more information about people in this time period. Now, this is kind of the opposite story. So this is a land record for Richard Freeman. His story was included in Henry Bronson's History of Waterbury that was published in the 1850s. Henry Bronson knew him when Mr. Freeman was a very elderly man. So Bronson mentions him, so he's actually in the history books, but Bronson didn't write very much about him. He described him primarily in terms of him being enslaved and being a servant to white people, and didn't really give us too much more about him. Just a little anecdote about how he was treated later in life. The land records tell us a good bit more. The land records, first of all, tell us he was a homeowner. That he bought property. And it even goes even further than that. So here, in 1788, he's referred to as Dick, an African servant of the Reverend James Scoville, late of Waterbury, now of Nova Scotia. So, a couple things. African servant means slave. The words were used interchangeably. Reverend Scoville, late of Waterbury, meaning that he was recently in Waterbury, isn't here anymore, now of Nova Scotia. Reverend Scoville was a loyalist. So when the British did not win the Revolutionary War, Scoville was one of many people from Connecticut who moved to Nova Scotia, which was still held by the British. When Reverend Scoville took off for Nova Scotia, he left Richard behind. And so that was his door to emancipation. He was abandoned property by law, and there's a lot of different things that could have happened, but in his case, he wound up being emancipated, and more than just being emancipated. So here, 1791, the town actually laid out land to him, the same way that they laid out land to white people in Waterbury. So this is a really incredible document, letting us know that he really was doing very well once Reverend Scoville took off. So here he's still referred to as Dick, an African, late a servant of Reverend Scoville. So here it's very specifically saying, no longer formerly a servant, formerly a slave of Reverend Scoville. So now he's free. Not referring to him by a last name yet. They do refer to him as an African because he was in fact African. That's part of what is in Bronson's history, where he was abducted as a child when he was living in Africa. So that is why he is specifically referred to as an African. So here he is getting that land given to him, the same as if he were a white man in Waterbury. And then in this document, we get even more information. So here now he has a last name, Freeman, 1792. And here he is he's purchasing a small dwelling house formerly built by Samson, a Negro man. So here's another person. Here's a person who may or may not be referenced in any other documents. There was a Samson much earlier in the 1700s in Waterbury. I don't know if it's the same man named Samson or a different man named Samson. But again, this is really rich historical information about people that does not appear anywhere else. These specific examples are African Americans, but the case is true as well, especially for women who often don't appear in other documentary sources, and for family structures that you might not see in other documentation. So, always look at those land records. You never know what you're going to find. And here, this last document for Mr. Freeman, you see he's not literate, but he does sign with his mark. And here he is actually selling some of his property later in his life. So just, land records are a tremendous resource of information that it can take time to look through them, but it's absolutely worth it. This, just for reference sake, this is what Waterbury's land records look like on the FamilySearch website. So not as pretty. Here it's from that microfilm, so it's black and white. The microfilm reel gets scanned in, and so this is what you would see if you are accessing the Waterbury land records remotely through the internet. You can zoom in on the records, so it's not just teeny tiny, like so. And so here's an example, again, even as late as 1850, It's really important, especially if you're looking for information about women in this time period. So Catherine Weston, wife of Nelson Weston, is purchasing land in Waterbury. 1850, there still are those restrictions on married women. So there was a Connecticut law throughout this time period that specifically prohibited married women from buying or selling property. So in this case, Catherine Weston is not buying this property in her name. She is Catherine Weston, wife of Nelson Weston. So even though she's the one who is signing the paperwork, she is signing as his wife, which means that technically he's the property owner, not her. So even if she's using her own money, doing all the business herself, it is still technically her husband who owns everything. 1856, Connecticut updated the law to allow women who had been abandoned by their husbands for at least 3 years to buy and sell real estate in their own name. So it was a long, slow process before women were able to become fully legally allowed to be property owners. But that doesn't mean that you're not going to find them conducting business transactions, so long as they have their husband's permission and approval. So again, looking for women in history, this is a really great place to look. They may not show up in other records. Even if there is a city directory from this time period, the wife's name is not going to be included. If you've looked at the 1840 census, you know in the 1840 census, it's just the head of household whose name you're going to see. So again, the land records really help fill out a huge chunk of the story. And that is what I have for you for the slideshow. And I'm going to actually turn off the recording so that you all have an opportunity to ask questions.